Eleanor Vance had learned that sanity, in a place designed for the mad, was something you wore carefully, like a coat turned inside out. Show too little of it, and they'd increase your medication until your thoughts moved through syrup. Show too much, and they'd call it compensatory behavior and add another diagnosis to your chart. So she had become invisible. Not the kind of invisible that made people forget you existed, but the kind that made them forget to look closely. The fluorescent lights in Ward C hummed their eternal song, a sound Eleanor had stopped truly hearing sometime around her 15th year inside. The walls, once white, had mellowed to the color of old teeth. The linoleum floor had been mopped so many times that its pattern had worn into suggestion, a ghost of blue diamonds that nobody but Eleanor seemed to remember. She was 73 years old now. She had entered these walls at 43, with hair the color of wet earth and a spine that held itself straight with fury. Now her hair had surrendered to white, and her spine had learned the curvature of survival. But her eyes, pale green, the color of sea glass, remained exactly as sharp as they'd been on the morning her children had signed the papers that ended her freedom. If you're joining me on this journey, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from today? Drop a comment below. Now, let me tell you how this woman's story began. The morning of January 14th, 1994, had started with coffee. Eleanor remembered this detail with the kind of precision that doctors found suspicious. They preferred their patients foggy, their memories unreliable. But Eleanor had catalogued every moment of that morning because she understood, even then, that she was living the last day of her real life. The coffee was weak. Her daughter Patricia always made it too weak. But Eleanor had smiled and thanked her anyway. Patricia was 41 then, a real estate agent with a husband who bought boats he couldn't afford and a lifestyle that required constant financial maintenance. Her son Richard was 38, a man whose charm had always outpaced his character. They'd both come to the house that morning. The house. Even now, 3 decades later, the thought of it made Eleanor's hands curl against the institutional blanket on her bed. A 3-bedroom Victorian on Maple Street, paid off 20 years before her husband Walter died. Walter had been a carpenter who'd spent 15 years restoring every inch of that home with his own hands. The crown molding, the built-in bookshelves, the hidden compartment behind the basement stairs where he'd kept his father's war medals and, though Eleanor hadn't discovered this until much later, other things, important things. The house had been worth perhaps $180,000 in 1994. Nothing spectacular by city standards, but in their small town of Millbrook, it was a respectable sum. More importantly, it was hers. Walter's pension was hers. The savings account they'd built over 40 years of marriage, hers, and her children had wanted all of it. Richard had done the talking. He'd always been good at talking. "Mom, we're worried about you. You've been confused lately, forgetting things. Pat and we just want to make sure you're okay. This doctor, Dr. Brennan, he's a friend of mine. He just wants to talk to you, run a few tests. Dr. Harold Brennan." Even now, Eleanor felt her jaw tighten at the name. A thin man with thin lips and a signature that had cost him nothing and cost her everything. She had gone willingly to his office that morning because she'd had no reason not to. Her children were worried. What mother wouldn't want to ease her children's concerns? The evaluation had lasted less than an hour. "Mrs. Vance," Dr. Brennan had said, his pen moving across the form without pause. "Your children have described episodes of paranoid ideation, confusion about dates and finances, and aggressive outbursts. Do you deny experiencing these things?" "I've never had any such episodes," Eleanor had replied. "I don't know why they would say that." Dr. Brennan had nodded, made a note. "Denial of symptoms is common," he'd said mildly, "and often a symptom in itself. That's circular logic." Another note. "Combative. Resistant to treatment recommendations." "What treatment? You haven't recommended any treatment. You've barely asked me any questions." Elevated agitation, defensive posturing. And so it had gone. Every word Eleanor spoke became evidence against her. Every attempt to defend herself became proof of the instability her children had invented. By noon, she had been involuntarily admitted to Whispering Pines Psychiatric Hospital for a 72-hour evaluation. She had never left. The first year had been the worst. Eleanor had screamed. She had demanded lawyers, demanded to see a judge, demanded her rights under laws she'd memorized from library books brought by orderlies who pitied her. She had written letters, hundreds of letters, to courts, to newspapers, to anyone who might listen. None of the letters ever left the facility. Dr. Brennan visited monthly at first, always with the same thin smile, always adjusting her medication based on her continued resistance to treatment. Eleanor learned quickly that resistance meant sedation, that fighting meant losing more of herself to the chemical fog they pumped into her system. So she had learned to perform. She had learned to take her pills, under the watchful eyes of nurses. Then, later, in her room, retrieve them from beneath her tongue and hide them in the hollow leg of her metal bed frame. She had learned which staff members could be trusted with small kindnesses and which ones reported every deviation to their supervisors. She had learned to recite the responses they wanted. I understand now why I needed help. My children only wanted what was best for me. I'm grateful for the care I've received. Lies. All of it, but lies that kept her dosage low enough to think, low enough to watch, low enough to remember exactly who she was and exactly what had been done to her. Richard and Patricia had visited once, 3 months after her admission. They'd come to have her sign papers, power of attorney, they said, so they could manage her affairs while she recovered. Eleanor had refused. She'd held the pen in her hand, looked into her daughter's eyes, and said, "I will die in here before I give you my home." Patricia's face had flickered, not with guilt, Eleanor noted, but with annoyance, the inconvenience of a mother who wouldn't cooperate. "We'll be back when you're feeling more rational," Richard had said. They never came back. 30 years is long enough to learn every dot, crack in every ceiling tile. Eleanor knew which orderly unlocked the supply closet at 6:47 each morning and forgot to check that it latched behind him. She knew that the security camera in the east corridor had a blind spot near the fire exit, a shadow of approximately 3 feet where a person could stand unobserved. She knew that on rainy nights, the night shift nurses congregated in the staff lounge to watch television, leaving the hallways monitored only by their occasional, predictable rounds. She knew these things, not because she'd been planning escape, not actively, not for most of those years. She knew them because paying attention was the only power she had left, in a place that had stripped her of name, of autonomy, of everything that made her Eleanor Vance rather than Patient 4471C. Observation was resistance. Knowing was surviving. But something changed in her 67th month of captivity. Something she overheard that planted a seed she'd carried ever since. 2 nurses had been talking in the hallway outside her room. Eleanor had kept her eyes closed, her breathing steady, playing the role of the sleeping patient so thoroughly that she'd almost convinced herself. "County's doing another audit of long-term patients," one nurse said. "Something about liability for the really old cases." "What kind of liability?" "Financial, I think. Properties tied to patients who were never properly," the voice had dropped, "transferred, signed over. Some of these people still technically own houses, bank accounts. The system just forgot about it. Like, who? That old woman in 4471, the one with the green eyes? Been here since Clinton's first term. Apparently, there's some property still listed under her name. County Recorder's Office caught it during a review. Probably worth a fortune now. If anyone could sort out the mess." The second nurse had laughed. "Good luck getting her to sign anything. That one's sharp. Too sharp, if you ask me." Their footsteps had receded down the hall, leaving Eleanor alone with her accelerating heartbeat and a single, clarifying thought: the house was still hers. For months after that overheard conversation, Eleanor had allowed herself to hope, and then punished herself for hoping. She was 70 years old, then 71, then 72. Her body had spent 3 decades being slowly poisoned by medications she didn't need. Her children were in their 60s and 70s now, presumably living whatever lives they'd built on the foundation of her suffering. Dr. Brennan would be retired, perhaps dead. What could she possibly do with this information except torture herself with it? But hope, once planted, is a stubborn thing. She began collecting details with renewed purpose. She learned that the property audit nurse had mentioned was still ongoing. Bureaucracies moved slowly, especially when money was involved. She learned that her house had indeed never been transferred, that the forged documents her children had attempted to file years ago had been rejected due to inconsistencies, and that the property had sat in a kind of legal limbo ever since, abandoned but not ownerless, rotting but not surrendered. And she learned, in fragments gathered over months of careful listening, that someone at the county level was asking questions. Questions about how a woman could be committed for 30 years without a proper hearing. Questions about who had signed the original papers. Questions about Dr. Harold Brennan, whose signature appeared on hundreds of dubious commitment orders across 3 decades, many of them connected to patients who had mysteriously signed away valuable properties shortly after admission. Someone was finally looking, but Eleanor had spent too long in Whispering Pines to trust that justice would find her. Justice required advocates, and she had none. Justice required evidence, and everything she knew was locked inside her head, inadmissible testimony from a woman the system had already decided was insane. If she wanted justice, she would have to get it herself, and to do that, she would have to get out. The plan took shape slowly, like water wearing away stone. First, the uniform. Maintenance staff wore gray coveralls that patients were forbidden to touch, but the supply closet, the one with the faulty latch, contained extras for new hires. Eleanor had 47 seconds, by her count, between when Henry the morning orderly opened the closet and when the latch finally caught. 47 seconds to cross 12 feet of hallway, reach the 3rd shelf, and secure a coverall in her size. She practiced the route in her mind for 2 months before she attempted it. Second, the timing. Friday nights were the quietest. The day shift was eager to leave, the night shift was minimal, and the administrative staff who might notice irregularities had been gone for hours. More importantly, Friday nights brought a particular nurse, Deborah, a kind woman who Eleanor had cultivated carefully over years of small conversations and sincere gratitude. Deborah's husband was ill. Deborah was tired. Deborah occasionally fell asleep in the staff lounge during her rounds between midnight and 3. Third, the route. The fire exit in the east corridor led to a loading dock used for medical supplies. The dock was monitored by a camera, but the camera had a blind spot. Eleanor had tested this dozens of times, shuffling past during her permitted walks, noting exactly where the lens failed to reach. From the dock, a drainage ditch ran alongside the property, leading eventually to Route 7. From Route 7, if the bus routes hadn't changed in 30 years, she could make it to Millbrook in 3 transfers and approximately 4 hours. She had $92 hidden in her mattress, accumulated over 3 decades from small kindnesses, from Christmas cards sent by the one cousin who occasionally remembered her, from dropped change that patients were not officially permitted to keep, but which Eleanor had systematically collected and concealed. Enough for bus fare. Enough to survive for a few days. The final element was the most crucial and the most uncertain, her body, 73 years of age. 30 years of institutional food, sedentary existence, and medications that had wreaked havoc on her bones and muscles. Could she walk the distance? Could she climb down from the loading dock? Could she run, if necessary? Eleanor didn't know, but she knew that if she didn't try soon, she wouldn't be able to try at all. The night she chose was a Friday in October. Rain had been falling since noon, not a deluge, but a steady, soaking rain that sent the outdoor staff inside and kept the residents subdued in their rooms. The kind of rain that made people look at the floor rather than at each other. The kind of rain that provided cover. Eleanor ate her dinner with her usual calm. She submitted to the evening medication round, palming the pills with practiced ease. She watched the last of the daylight fade through her barred window, and she thought about Walter. He had been dead for 40 years now, longer than they'd been married, but she still remembered his hands, rough from wood and varnish, gentle when they touched her face. She remembered the way he'd laughed when she said something clever, the way he'd held her during the hard years when the babies wouldn't come, and then, finally, miraculously, came. Richard and Patricia, their children, the ones who had grown into strangers and then into enemies. Walter had seen it, she thought now. He'd seen something wrong in Richard's smile, something cold in Patricia's calculations. He'd tried to tell her, gently, in the years before his heart gave out, "Keep an eye on them, Ellie. They're our blood, but they're not our heart." She hadn't listened. She hadn't wanted to believe. But Walter, in his carpenter's way, had prepared for what he couldn't prevent. He'd built hiding places into that house. Not paranoid, just practical, he'd said. A man likes to know his important things are safe. She hadn't understood then, but if the house was still standing, if she could reach it, maybe she would understand now. At 11:47 p.m., Eleanor Vance rose from her bed for the last time. She moved carefully, listening for footsteps in the corridor. The facility was quiet, not the dead silence of sleep, but the muffled hush of a place winding down. Televisions murmured behind closed doors. Somewhere, a patient cried out in a dream. Eleanor crossed to her bed frame and retrieved the stolen coverall from where she'd hidden it weeks ago, wrapped in her extra blanket. Gray and shapeless, it swallowed her thin frame, but it would do. She pulled her white hair back with the rubber band she'd saved from a newspaper. Patients weren't given hairbands anymore, not after an incident years ago, and tucked it under a cap she'd fashioned from a spare pillowcase. In the dim light, she looked less like a patient and more like a tired worker heading home late. She didn't look back at her room. There was nothing there worth remembering except the decades it had stolen from her. The corridor was empty. Eleanor's soft-soled slippers made almost no sound on the linoleum as she walked with purpose. Not hurried, not hesitant, but with the steady pace of someone who belonged there and had somewhere to be. She had learned that walking like you had the right to be somewhere was often enough to convince others that you did. The supply closet door was closed. The east corridor camera was pointing north, as it always did. The staff lounge door was shut, but through the window, Eleanor could see the blue glow of a television and Deborah's head tilted back, eyes closed. The fire exit was 12 steps away. 10, 7, 5. Eleanor's hand closed around the release bar. The mechanism was supposed to trigger an alarm, but maintenance had been complaining for months about the sensor malfunction. Budget cuts, they said, not a priority. She pressed down. The door opened with a whisper of cold air and rain. For one endless moment, Eleanor stood on the threshold between the only world she'd known for 30 years and the darkness beyond. The rain was cold on her face. Real rain. Not the filtered air of Ward C, but weather. Actual weather, falling from an actual sky. She stepped through. The loading dock was slick with rain, but the railing held as she lowered herself down to the drainage ditch. Her bones protested. Her lungs, weakened by years of stale air and stolen pills, burned with the effort of controlled breathing. But she kept moving, one foot, then the next. The ditch ran alongside the property exactly as she remembered, and the darkness swallowed her as completely as she'd hoped. By the time anyone noticed patient 4471C was missing, Eleanor Vance would be gone. But the real question, the one that had sustained her through 30 years of captivity, remained unanswered. What was waiting for her inside the house that still impossibly bore her name? If Eleanor's story is already gripping you, please hit that subscribe button. You'll want to be here for what she discovers next. And let me know in the comments. Have you ever known someone who was dismissed or silenced when they were telling the truth? Sometimes the crazy ones are the only ones seeing clearly. The drainage ditch ended at a chain-link fence that separated Whispering Pines from Dar, the service road beyond. Eleanor had known about the fence, had seen it from the windows during her permitted outdoor time, but knowing about something and confronting it with a 73-year-old body were different matters entirely. The rain had soaked through her, stolen coverall within minutes of leaving the building. Her fingers, stiff with cold and age, found the chain link and held on while she assessed the obstacle. The fence was perhaps 6 feet tall, topped with a curl of wire that wasn't quite barbed but wasn't friendly either. In another life, in her real life, she might have laughed at the idea of climbing it, but Eleanor Vance had not survived 30 years of captivity by accepting limitations. She followed the fence line for perhaps 100 yards, her slippers squelching in the mud, until she found what she'd hoped for, a section where the ground had eroded beneath the fence, creating a gap of maybe 18 inches. Not much, but enough. Getting down was easier than she'd expected. Getting through was agony. The mud was cold and thick, and the bottom edge of the fence caught her coverall, tore it, scraped along her back as she army crawled through the gap like a soldier in some war she'd never signed up to fight. By the time she emerged on the other side, she was shaking, from cold, from exertion, from the sheer overwhelming reality of what she was doing. She was outside, actually outside in the actual world, for the first time in 3 decades. For a moment, Eleanor simply lay in the mud and let the rain fall on her face. The sky above was black and starless, choked with clouds, but it was sky. Real sky, stretching forever in every direction, unbroken by bars or wire-reinforced glass. She could smell earth and wet leaves and car exhaust from somewhere distant, the ordinary smells of a world that had continued turning without her. Then she heard the dogs. Whispering Pines kept German shepherds for security, though Eleanor had only ever seen them from a distance during the facility's occasional lockdown drills. Now their barking cut through the rain, sharp and urgent, and she understood that her absence had been discovered. She forced herself up. Her back screamed where the fence had torn it, and her left knee, always weak, weaker now, threatened to buckle. But she moved, one foot, then the next, following the service road toward the distant glow of Route 7's streetlights. The dog's barking faded as she walked, replaced by the steady rhythm of rain and her own labored breathing. Either they hadn't picked up her trail yet, or the rain was washing her scent away as quickly as she left it. Either way, she kept moving. The bus shelter on Route 7 was a concrete slab with a rusted metal roof, illuminated by a single flickering light that attracted moths despite the rain. Eleanor collapsed onto the bench and allowed herself 60 seconds of rest, counting them off in her head, because counting had been one of her survival tools in the ward, a way to structure time when time had lost all meaning. At 57 seconds, headlights appeared in the distance. She tensed, prepared to run if necessary, though where she would run to, and whether her body would cooperate, remained open questions. But the vehicle that emerged from the rain wasn't a Whispering Pines security car or a police cruiser. It was a bus. A public transit bus, its destination sign reading Millbrook Central via County Line. Eleanor had not ridden a bus in 30 years. She had no idea what the fare was now, whether they still accepted cash, whether the routes she remembered still existed. But when the bus hissed to a stop and the doors folded open, she climbed aboard as if she'd done it yesterday. The driver was a heavy-set woman with tired eyes and a name tag that read Dolores. She looked at Eleanor, mud-streaked, rain-soaked, wearing a torn maintenance coverall over what were clearly pajamas, and raised one eyebrow. "Rough night, honey? You have no idea." Eleanor's voice came out rusty, unused to speaking above the institutional murmur she'd cultivated for decades. She fumbled in the coverall's pocket for the money she'd hidden there, bills soft with age, coins that might not even be in circulation anymore. How much to Millbrook? Dolores studied her for a long moment. Eleanor waited for the questions, the suspicion, the call to police that would end everything before it began. Instead, Dolores shook her head and waved toward the seats. "Get out of the rain, honey. We'll worry about fare later." Eleanor sank into a seat near the back and watched the lights of Whispering Pines disappear behind her. The bus was nearly empty, just 2 other passengers, a young man with earbuds who never looked up from his phone, and an elderly woman with shopping bags who dozed against the window. For the first time in 30 years, Eleanor was surrounded by people who had no idea who she was. No chart followed her here. No diagnosis preceded her. She was just another tired passenger on a late-night bus, anonymous and ordinary and free. She began to cry, silently, without drama, just tears tracking down her mud-streaked face while the bus carried her toward the home she'd been stolen from. The journey took longer than Eleanor remembered, or perhaps Her memory of Millbrook's distance from the city had simply eroded over the years. The bus stopped at stations she didn't recognize, in neighborhoods that had been fields when she'd last seen them. Shopping centers had sprung up where farms once stood, roads had been widened, renamed, rerouted, but some things remained. When the bus finally turned onto the old county road that led into Millbrook proper, Eleanor felt her heart squeeze in recognition. There was Henderson's farm, smaller now, the old barn replaced with something prefabricated, but the stone wall along the road was the same wall she'd driven past 1,000 times. There was the Methodist church, its white steeple visible even through the rain, its parking lot empty at this hour. There was the elementary school where Richard and Patricia had learned to read, to write, to become the strangers who would eventually betray her. Millbrook Central, Dolores announced. End of the line, folks. Eleanor rose on unsteady legs. When she passed the driver's seat, she pressed several bills into Dolores's hand, more than the fare, probably. But it was the least she could offer this woman, who had asked no questions. Thank you, Eleanor said, for the kindness. Dolores looked at the money, then at Eleanor's face. Whatever she saw there seemed to reach her, because her expression softened into something like recognition. You be careful out there, honey. Whatever you're running from, or running to, I hope you find what you're looking for. Eleanor stepped off the bus into the rain-washed streets of the town that had once been her home. Maple Street was a 20-minute walk from the bus station. Eleanor knew this because she had made the walk hundreds of times in her former life, to the grocery store, to the library, to visit neighbors who had probably died or moved away years ago. 20 minutes at a normal pace, on healthy legs, in good weather. Tonight, in the rain, with a body weakened by 30 years of institutional neglect, it took her nearly an hour. She stopped twice to rest, sheltering under awnings of businesses that hadn't existed when she'd last walked these streets. A coffee shop, where the hardware store used to be, a yoga studio in the old Five and Dime. The town had changed, the way all towns change, growing unfamiliar even as its bones remained the same. But Maple Street was exactly as she remembered. The old oak trees still lined the sidewalk, their branches arching overhead to create a tunnel of leaves that would be glorious in autumn. The streetlights were the same vintage style the town council had installed in 1978, their warm glow softened by the rain. The houses were the same Victorian and colonial revival styles that had defined the neighborhood since its construction in the 1922, though some had been painted new colors, renovated, updated for modern living, all except one. Eleanor stopped walking. The house at 742 Maple Street stood at the end of the block, set back from the road behind a yard that had become a wilderness. The white paint Walter had so carefully maintained had faded to gray and peeled away in long strips, exposing weathered wood beneath. The shutters hung at angles, some missing entirely. The porch roof sagged where a support beam had given way, and the front steps, where Eleanor had sat with Walter on summer evenings, watching fireflies and talking about nothing important, had collapsed into a heap of rotted lumber. The windows were dark. Some were broken, covered with plywood or plastic sheeting that had itself deteriorated over the years. The chimney leaned slightly, and the roof showed patches of exposed underlayment where shingles had blown away and never been replaced. It looked like a haunted house from a children's Brenning story. It looked like a corpse. It looked like home. Before you continue with me on this journey, I want to pause and ask, have you ever returned to a place after years away and found it both exactly as you remembered and completely transformed? Let me know in the comments what Eleanor felt standing in front of that house. The collision of memory and reality is something I think many of us can understand. Eleanor stood at the edge of the overgrown yard for a long time. The rain had gentled to a mist, and the first gray suggestion of dawn was beginning to lighten the eastern sky. She had perhaps an hour before the neighborhood woke, before early risers emerged to collect newspapers and notice a strange old woman standing in the street, staring at the abandoned property that had been a local curiosity for decades. She should move. She knew she should move. But her feet wouldn't cooperate. This was the house where she had raised her children, the house where she had loved her husband for 40 years, where she had nursed him through his final illness, where she had held his hand as he slipped away and promised him that she would take care of everything. The house where her children had come to visit after the funeral with their calculators and their appraisers, already dividing up a life that wasn't finished yet. The house where she had been stolen from herself. A light came on in the house next door. The Hendersons' old place, though they were certainly gone now, replaced by strangers who had probably heard stories about the crazy woman who used to live at 742. Eleanor forced her legs to move, carrying her through the gap in the rusted fence, through weeds that reached her waist and scratched at her torn coverall, up to the side of the house where the kitchen door had always stuck in wet weather and never quite locked properly. The door was still there, though the screen that had covered it was long gone. Eleanor tried the handle, rusted, resistant, but it turned. The wood of the frame had swollen and warped over the years, and she had to put her shoulder into it, had to push with strength she didn't know she still possessed, but the door gave way with a groan of protest and swung inward. The smell hit her first: mildew, rot, the dusty, layered scent of decades of neglect. Beneath it, fainter, the ghost of something else, lemon polish maybe, or the herbs she used to hang in the kitchen window, the smell of her own history, preserved like a specimen under glass. Eleanor stepped inside. The kitchen was destroyed, not by time alone, though time had certainly done its work. Someone had been here, vandals, probably, or squatters seeking shelter over the years. The cabinets hung open, their contents long since removed or scattered. The refrigerator stood with its door ajar, its interior black with mold. The window over the sink was broken, and leaves had blown in to form a thick carpet on the linoleum floor, but the bones were still there. The cabinets Walter had built by hand, with their carefully routed edges and solid maple frames. The tin ceiling he'd restored when they first moved in, now stained with water damage but still bearing its original pressed pattern of flowers and vines. The breakfast nook where Patricia had done her homework, where Richard had announced his engagement to the first of 3 wives, where Eleanor had sat alone after Walter's funeral and wondered how she would survive without him. She had survived, just not in the way she'd imagined. Eleanor moved through the kitchen into the hallway, her hand trailing along the wall for support. The wallpaper she'd chosen in 1972, a subtle pattern of blue hydrangeas, had peeled away in sheets, revealing the older paper beneath it, a yellow floral pattern that had been here when they bought the house. Layers of history, exposed by decay. The living room was worse. The ceiling had partially collapsed, exposing the attic space above and allowing rain to damage everything below. The furniture was gone, taken, probably, by her children after they'd failed to secure the deed, or looted by others over the years. Only the built-in bookshelves remained, empty now, their wood warped and stained, but they were still standing. Walter's bookshelves, which he'd designed to frame the fireplace, which he'd fitted with hidden compartments that only he and Eleanor knew about. Eleanor's breath caught. She crossed the room, debris crunching under her soaked slippers, and knelt before the bookshelves. Her fingers found the 3rd shelf from the bottom, the panel that had always looked like solid backing but wasn't. She pressed in the sequence Walter had taught her: left corner, right corner, center, hold for 3 seconds, and felt the mechanism release. The panel swung open, revealing a space perhaps 2 feet wide and 18 inches deep. And inside was a metal lockbox, its surface dulled by time but otherwise intact. Beside it, wrapped in plastic that had miraculously kept the moisture out, was a large manila envelope, and beneath both, a cassette tape in a clear case, the kind people used for recording voice memos before the digital age made them obsolete. Eleanor's hands shook as she reached for them. Walter had known. Somehow, impossibly, Walter had known that she would need this, that someone would try to take what was hers, that the children they had raised together had inherited something other than their parents' values. She pulled the envelope out first, tearing the plastic away to reveal documents inside. Even in the dim gray light filtering through the broken windows, she could see official letterhead, notarized stamps, dates and signatures in Walter's careful hand. The first page was a property deed, the original deed to 742 Maple Street, recorded in 1962, listing Walter James Vance and Eleanor Marie Vance as joint tenants with right of survivorship, not the copy her children would have obtained from the county. The original, with the original signatures, the original notarization, the original recording stamps. The second page was a letter. Eleanor squinted at Walter's handwriting, familiar even after all these years. My dearest Ellie, if you're reading this, I wasn't wrong about them. I'm sorry. I hoped I was paranoid, that my suspicions about Richard's debts and Patricia's husband's schemes were just an old man's worries. But I've seen how they look at this house, how they calculate its value like it's just another number on a spreadsheet instead of 40 years of our lives. Everything you need is here. The deed, our financial records, and, Ellie, I hope you never need this, recordings of conversations I had with Richard. He didn't know I was taping, which might make them inadmissible in court, but they'll show anyone who listens exactly what kind of man our son became. There's also a letter from Dr. Brennan. Richard left it here by mistake after one of his visits. I don't think he even realized he dropped it. It talks about arrangements and considerations. I don't know exactly what it means, but I know it's not right. I love you, Ellie. I've loved you since I was 22 years old, and you walked into my father's shop looking for someone to fix a broken chair. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better, but maybe this will help. Always yours, Walter. The letter was dated 6 months before Walter's heart attack, 6 months before he died and left Eleanor alone with children who had been waiting. She now understood for exactly this moment. She set the letter aside with trembling hands and opened the lockbox. Inside was money, cash, bundled and old, but still legal tender. Eleanor didn't count it, but there were dozens of bills, hundreds maybe. An emergency fund that Walter had never told her about, perhaps suspecting that if the children knew of its existence, they would find a way to claim it. There were also photographs. Old photographs, their edges curled with age, showing Richard and Patricia as children, innocent, happy, before whatever had gone wrong with them had gone wrong. And one photograph that made Eleanor's throat close, herself and Walter on their wedding day, young and hopeful and completely unaware of what the future held. But it was the final item that made her stop breathing entirely. A letter on Dr. Harold Brennan's medical letterhead, dated January 3rd, 1994, 11 days before Eleanor's commitment, addressed to Richard Vance. Richard, per our agreement, I've reviewed the documentation you provided regarding your mother's alleged symptoms. I want to be clear that what you're describing does not constitute grounds for involuntary commitment under standard diagnostic criteria. However, given the circumstances you've outlined and the financial consideration we discussed, I'm prepared to conduct an evaluation that will support your petition. The fee we agreed upon should be delivered before the evaluation date. Cash only, as discussed. Once the commitment is finalized and permanent, I'll expect the second payment. Please ensure your sister is present during the evaluation to corroborate your account. Consistency in family testimony is essential for the paperwork to hold up. I trust this will resolve your concerns about the property situation. H. Brennan, MD. Eleanor read the letter 3 times. Her vision blurred, from tears or exhaustion or shock, she couldn't tell. There it was, proof. Written in black and white, undeniable and damning. Her children had paid a doctor to lock her away. They had planned it, discussed fees, arranged details, coordinated testimony, not a spur-of-the-moment decision born of genuine concern, but a calculated theft dressed in the language of mental health. 30 years of her life, purchased for a bribe. The sun was rising now, pale light filtering through the broken windows, illuminating the ruin of everything she'd once called home. Eleanor sat on the floor of her destroyed living room, surrounded by water damage and debris, holding evidence that could set her free, or at least prove that she had never deserved to be caged in the first place. She didn't know what to do next. She was 73 years old, exhausted, injured, soaked to the bone. The authorities were surely looking for her by now. She had no identification, no resources beyond the cash in Walter's lockbox, no allies in a world that had moved on without her. But she had proof, and she had a name, Dr. Harold Brennan, and she had 30 years of rage, carefully banked, waiting for this moment. Eleanor Vance gathered the documents, placed them carefully back in the lockbox, and began to plan. Eleanor has found what she came for, but finding the truth is only the beginning. In the next part, she'll have to decide what to do with it, and the journey from a condemned house to a courtroom is longer than you might think. If you're invested in Eleanor's fight for justice, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. What she does next took more courage than the escape itself. Part 3. The quiet war. Eleanor spent the first night in her own house for the first time in 30 years, sleeping in the basement. Not by choice. The upper floors were too exposed, too visible through broken windows to anyone who might be searching for a missing psychiatric patient. But the basement, accessed through a door in the kitchen that's still locked from the inside, offered darkness and concealment. Walter had finished it himself in 1975, installing proper walls and flooring, a small bathroom that no longer worked, and built-in storage cabinets that had survived the years of neglect far better than the rooms above. She found blankets in one of those cabinets, musty and mouse-chewed, but dry. She found candles in another, along with matches that still struck after decades in their sealed tin. She even found canned goods on the utility shelves, their labels faded beyond reading, which she didn't dare eat, but which reminded her that this house had once been prepared for emergencies. Walter had always believed in being prepared. That first night, Eleanor didn't sleep so much as collapse. Her body had reached its limits. The escape, the journey, the emotional devastation of seeing her home in ruins, the shock of discovering Walter's evidence. She lay on the concrete floor wrapped in mouse-eaten blankets, clutching the lockbox to her chest like a child with a stuffed animal, and let exhaustion drag her under. She dreamed of Walter. Not the sick Walter of his final months, but the young Walter who had built this house with his hands, who had danced with her in the empty living room before they owned furniture, who had held their babies, and promised her that everything would be all right. In the dream, he was standing in the kitchen, whole and healthy, and when she tried to reach him, he smiled and said, "You found it, Ellie. Now finish it." She woke to silence and gray light filtering through the basement's small windows. Every muscle in her body screamed as she forced herself upright. The scratch on her back from the fence had crusted over, but throbbed with the promise of infection. Her left knee had swollen to nearly twice its normal size. Her chest ached with each breath. Not her heart, she didn't think, but the simple strain of a body pushed far beyond its capabilities. She needed medical attention. She needed food, clean water, a change of clothes. She needed to become invisible again, at least long enough to figure out her next move. But first, she needed to understand exactly what she had. By candlelight, Eleanor spread Walter's documents across the basement floor and studied them with the systematic attention she'd honed over 30 years of having nothing to pair. Do but observe. The original deed was exactly what it appeared to be, proof of ownership that predated any documents her children might have filed. It wouldn't be enough on its own to reclaim the property, not without proper legal process, but it established her standing. She had a right to be here. This was her house. Walter's letter was heartbreaking but not evidentiary. A husband's suspicions about his children, however accurate, wouldn't hold up in court, but it provided context, a narrative that someone might find compelling if she could find someone willing to listen. The financial records were more useful than she'd initially realized. Walter had kept meticulous accounts of every dollar that flowed in and out of their household, going back to the 1,960 seconds. Cross-referenced with the timeline of Richard's visits and requests for loans, they painted a picture of a son who had been bleeding his parents financially for years before they died, or, in Eleanor's case, before she was made to disappear. But the crown jewel was Dr. Brennan's letter. Eleanor read it again in the candlelight, parsing every word. Per our agreement, financial consideration we discussed, cash only. The second payment, this wasn't ambiguous. This wasn't open to interpretation. This was a medical professional explicitly agreeing to falsify a psychiatric evaluation in exchange for money. The cassette tape, she couldn't verify. She had no way to play it, no device that would accept the outdated format. But if Walter's letter was accurate, it contained recorded conversations with Richard, admissions, perhaps, or simply evidence of his character that might support her case. She needed help, professional help, from people who understood the legal system and could translate her evidence into action, and she needed to stay hidden while she found it. Eleanor remained in the basement for 3 days. She rationed the cash from Walter's lockbox, venturing out only at night to purchase supplies from a gas station convenience store on the edge of town. The young clerk there barely looked at her, just another disheveled old woman buying crackers and bottled water with crumpled bills. Nobody memorable, nobody worth reporting. During the days, she slept and healed and planned. Her body slowly recovered from the escape, though her knee remained swollen and the scratch on her back developed an angry redness that worried her. She needed antibiotics, but antibiotics required either a prescription or a hospital, and hospitals meant questions she couldn't answer. On the 3rd night, she found what she was looking for. The Millbrook Public Library had computers now. She'd seen them through the window during one of her midnight walks through town, rows of screens glowing in the darkened building. The library had always opened early, she remembered, to accommodate commuters who wanted to read the newspapers before work. If the tradition had held, she might have access to information that could help her plan her next move. At 6:47 a.m. on her 4th morning of freedom, Eleanor Vance walked through the front doors of the Millbrook Public Library for the first time in 30 years. The library had changed, but not as much as she'd feared. The card catalog was gone, replaced by computer terminals, and the old wooden checkout desk had been modernized with scanners and electronic systems. But the bones were the same: the high ceilings, the tall windows, the smell of books and old paper that had been her refuge during the long years of Walter's illness. A young woman sat at the reference desk, her dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, a coffee cup steaming beside her keyboard. She looked up as Eleanor entered, and her expression flickered, not with recognition, but with concern. "Ma'am, are you all right?" Eleanor caught a glimpse of herself in the glass door as it swung closed. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had slept in a basement for 3 days, whose clothes were torn and filthy, whose hair hadn't been properly washed in nearly a week. She looked homeless. She looked crazy. She looked like someone who should be in a psychiatric ward. "I'm fine," Eleanor said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I just need to use a computer. And perhaps," she hesitated, "to find some information about legal aid services in the area." The young woman, her name tag read Maria, studied her for a long moment. Eleanor braced herself for the questions, the suspicions, the call to authorities that would end everything. Instead, Maria said, "The computers are in the back. First hour is free." And she reached under her desk and produced a granola bar, sliding it across the counter. "You look like you could use this." Eleanor took the granola bar with hands that trembled slightly. "Thank you. Legal aid," Maria continued, as if she hadn't just performed an act of unexpected kindness. "The county office closed down 3 years ago. Budget cuts. But there's a non-profit called Justice Works about 20 minutes from here. They handle cases for people who can't afford lawyers, mostly civil stuff, housing disputes, benefits, appeals, that kind of thing." "Housing disputes," Eleanor repeated. "That might be exactly what I need." Maria wrote the address on a slip of paper and handed it across. "They open at 9. Bus runs every half hour from the stop outside." She paused, her dark eyes meeting Eleanor's. "Whatever you're dealing with, I hope you find help. Everyone deserves someone in their corner." Eleanor tucked the address into her pocket, along with the granola bar, and made her way to the computer terminals in the back. The computer was simultaneously familiar and foreign. She had used them occasionally before her commitment, but the technology had evolved beyond recognition. It took her 20 minutes just to figure out how to open the web browser, and another 10 to navigate to a search engine. But eventually, her fingers found their rhythm, and she began to research. Dr. Harold Brennan, she discovered, had retired from Whispering Pines in 2008, 14 years into her incarceration. He had been the subject of several malpractice complaints over the years, though none had resulted in significant sanctions. He was now 81 years old. living in a retirement community about 30 miles away, presumably enjoying the fruits of a career that had included, among other things, imprisoning innocent women for profit. Her son, Richard, was harder to track. The search results suggested he had declared bankruptcy twice in the past 20 years, divorced 3 times, and moved frequently. His current address was unknown, at least from what Eleanor could find in public records, but Patricia had done well. Her daughter was now a prominent real estate developer in the city, with a website featuring professional photographs and a client list that included luxury properties worth millions. Eleanor stared at Patricia's smiling face on the screen. 68 years old now, silver hair professionally styled, wearing jewelry that cost more than Eleanor's house had been worth in 1994. Patricia had built an empire, presumably on the foundation of whatever she'd managed to steal from her parents before Eleanor's commitment made further theft unnecessary. But the property itself had never been transferred. Eleanor found the county recorder's database and searched until she located the records for 742 Maple Street. The house was still listed under Eleanor Marie Vance's name, with a note indicating ownership disputed, pending resolution. Multiple liens had been filed against it over the years, unpaid property taxes, code enforcement fines, but no one had successfully claimed it, because the original deed, the one that would have been required to transfer ownership, had been hidden in Walter's secret compartment all along. Eleanor printed everything she could find: the property records, the information about Brennan, the business listings for Patricia. She used nearly all of her remaining coins on the library's printer, but when she finished, she had a stack of documentation that, combined with Walter's evidence, told a story. Now she just needed someone willing to help her tell it. If this story is touching your heart, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever faced a system that seemed designed to silence you? Have you ever had to fight for something everyone told you to give up? Eleanor's battle is just beginning, and she's going to need every bit of strength she's gathered over 30 years of waiting. Justice Works occupied a converted storefront in a strip mall between a nail salon and a tax preparation office. The sign was hand-painted, slightly crooked, and the waiting room contained mismatched chairs and a coffee maker that looked older than Eleanor felt. It was, in other words, exactly the kind of place where someone might actually listen. The receptionist was a young man with kind eyes and a slight accent that Eleanor couldn't place. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I have." Eleanor hesitated, trying to summarize 30 years of injustice in a sentence. "I have a complicated situation and evidence of crimes committed against me. I need legal help." The young man studied her for a moment, taking in her disheveled appearance, her obvious exhaustion, the plastic bag containing her precious documents clutched against her chest. "Have a seat," he said. "I'll see if someone can see you." Eleanor sat. The chairs were uncomfortable, but after 30 years of institutional furniture, she barely noticed. She watched other clients come and go, a woman with 3 children in tow, arguing about child support, an elderly man confused about his Medicare benefits, a young couple facing eviction. The ordinary emergencies of ordinary lives playing out in this shabby office where someone, apparently, still cared enough to help. Nearly an hour passed before the receptionist called her name. "Miss Vance? Miss Vance. Chen will see you now." Margaret Chen was perhaps 35, with sharp features and sharper eyes that assessed Eleanor with obvious curiosity. Her office was small but organized, with law degrees on the wall and case files stacked in neat piles on every available surface. "Please sit down." She gestured to a chair across from her desk. "Carlos tells me you have a complicated situation. Why don't you start from the beginning?" Eleanor had rehearsed this moment in the basement, trying to find words that would convey the truth without making her sound like exactly the kind of person who belonged in a psychiatric ward. Now, facing this young woman with the sharp eyes and the law degrees, she found that the rehearsed words had fled. "I escaped from Whispering Pines Psychiatric Hospital 4 days ago," she said instead. "I was committed there 30 years ago by my children, who bribed a doctor to declare me mentally incompetent so they could steal my property. I have evidence, I have proof, and I want to take back what's mine." Margaret Chen's expression didn't change. She didn't reach for the phone, didn't call for security, didn't dismiss Eleanor as delusional. She simply picked up a legal pad and a pen. "Tell me everything," she said, "from the beginning." So Eleanor did. She talked for nearly 2 hours, interrupted only by Margaret's occasional questions, clarifying details, requesting dates, asking about documentation. She produced Walter's documents one by one, explaining what each was and how she'd found it. She handed over Dr. Brennan's letter, watching Margaret's face as she read it, seeing the slight tightening around her eyes that suggested the young lawyer understood exactly what she was looking at. When Eleanor finally finished, her throat was raw and her hands were shaking. She had never told this story to anyone who actually listened. 30 years of silence, broken in a strip mall office with fluorescent lighting and a coffee maker that made strange noises in the corner. Margaret set down her pen and leaned back in her chair. "Mrs. Vance," she said carefully, "I want to be honest with you. What you're describing, if even half of it is accurate, involves multiple serious crimes. Bribery, conspiracy, fraud, false imprisonment. These are not small matters. I know. The statute of limitations has run out on many of these crimes. Dr. Brennan can't be criminally prosecuted for taking a bribe 30 years ago, even with written evidence. Your children, depending on exactly what they did, may also be protected by time." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest. "So there's nothing I can do?" "I didn't say that." Margaret picked up Dr. Brennan's letter again, studying it. "Criminal charges may be off the table, but civil remedies aren't necessarily. And more importantly, the wrongful commitment itself, if we can prove it, may give us grounds to challenge everything that followed. The property liens, the unpaid taxes, your current status as a fugitive from a facility you should never have been placed in. How do we prove it?" Margaret smiled grimly. "That's where it gets complicated. We'd need to demonstrate that Dr. Brennan's evaluation was fraudulent, that your children provided false testimony, and that no legitimate medical basis existed for your commitment. It would require expert witnesses, potentially other patients who were similarly wronged, documentation of Brennan's pattern of behavior." "I was there for 30 years, Eleanor said quietly. "I watched everything. I remember other patients, other people who didn't belong there, who were committed for reasons that didn't make sense, inheritances that disappeared, family members who visited once and never came back." Margaret's eyes sharpened. "You have names? I have memories. Whether the people are still alive, still institutionalized, I don't know. It's a start." Margaret stood, moving to her file cabinet. "I need to be clear about something, Mrs. Vance. I'm one lawyer in a non-profit office that handles hundreds of cases a year. I don't have the resources to take on a hospital, a doctor, and your children all at once. This would need to be bigger than just me." "What do you mean?" Margaret turned back to face her, her expression thoughtful. "I mean that, for this to work, for you to have any real chance at justice, this story needs to be told, not just in a courtroom, but publicly. The kind of systemic abuse you're describing, if it's true, didn't happen in a vacuum. Other people enabled it. Other people knew about it. And other people might be willing to talk if they understood they weren't alone." She pulled a business card from her desk drawer and handed it to Eleanor. "There's a journalist I've worked with before. Young, hungry, specializes in institutional corruption. She broke a story last year about a nursing home that was drugging patients to keep them compliant. She understands how these systems work, and she's not afraid of powerful people who want to stay hidden." Eleanor looked at the card. "Sarah Okonkwo, investigative reporter, the Millbrook Independent. You want me to go to the press? I want you to consider it. The evidence you have is compelling, but it's not complete. A journalist can dig in ways I can't. Interview people, request records, put pressure on institutions that prefer to keep their secrets. And frankly, Mrs. Vance, public attention might be your best protection right now." "Protection?" Margaret's expression was serious. "You're a fugitive from a psychiatric facility. Right now, the easiest thing for everyone involved would be for you to quietly disappear, to be found and returned and medicated until you can't tell anyone what you know. But if your story is public, if people are paying attention, that becomes much harder. Eleanor thought about the dogs she'd heard on the night of her escape. She thought about the orderlies at Whispering Pines, the ones who'd seemed almost afraid of certain patients, the ones who knew things they weren't supposed to know. She thought about 30 years of watching and waiting and surviving. "When can I meet her?" Eleanor asked. The journalist? Margaret smiled. "I'll make a call." Sarah Okonkwo arrived at Justice Works 3 hours later, a laptop bag slung over her shoulder and a look of barely contained excitement on her face. She was younger than Eleanor had expected, late 20s, perhaps with natural hair cropped close to her head and eyes that seemed to absorb everything around her. She shook Eleanor's hand with a grip that was firm without being aggressive, and she sat down across from her without any of the careful distance that people usually maintained when confronted with someone who had spent 30 years in a psychiatric ward. "Mrs. Vance," she said, "Margaret tells me you have evidence of something big. I'd like to hear your story, all of it, in your own words. And I want you to know that whatever you tell me, I won't publish anything without your consent. But if what you're describing is real, it's exactly the kind of story that needs to be told." Eleanor had told her story once already today, but she told it again, and this time, with Sarah's questions probing at the details Margaret hadn't thought to ask, new pieces emerged. The names of other patients Eleanor had known, women and men whose circumstances had seemed suspicious, whose families had visited once and disappeared, whose properties had mysteriously changed hands. The orderlies who had been kind and the ones who had been cruel, and what that cruelty had hidden, the medications that had kept everyone compliant, the paperwork that was always just out of reach, the subtle ways that Whispering Pines had maintained control over people who should never have been there in the first place. When she finished, Sarah sat back with an expression Eleanor couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Vance," she said slowly, "I've been investigating institutional abuse for 5 years. I've seen falsified records, drugged patients, financial exploitation. But what you're describing, if I can verify it, this is systemic. This isn't one bad doctor or one corrupt administrator. This is a pattern of using the psychiatric system to disappear inconvenient people." "I know," Eleanor said. "I lived it." Sarah leaned forward. "Here's what I need from you. I need access to your documents, copies, not originals. I need permission to investigate Dr. Brennan, your children, and anyone else who might have been involved. And I need you to trust me, even when things get difficult, because this is going to get difficult before it gets better. And in return, I'll make sure the world knows what happened to you. Not as a sob story, not as a human interest piece, but as journalism, evidence-based, verified, impossible to dismiss as the ravings of a disturbed woman. I'll make them answer for what they did." Eleanor thought about the 30 years she'd spent being dismissed, being silenced, being erased. She thought about Walter's letter, about his faith that she would find the evidence and finish what he couldn't. "Where do we start?" she asked. Sarah smiled, not a kind smile, but a fierce one, the smile of someone who had found the story she'd been waiting for. "We start with Dr. Harold Brennan," she said, "and we find out just how many other Eleanor Vances are out there, waiting for someone to finally listen." The investigation took 3 months. 3 months of Sarah Okonkwo digging through records, interviewing former staff members, and tracking down families who had lost loved ones to Whispering Pines under suspicious circumstances. 3 months of Margaret Chen filing motions, challenging Eleanor's commitment status, and building a civil case that grew larger with each passing week. 3 months of Eleanor hiding in plain sight, living in a small room above the Justice Works office that Margaret had quietly arranged, eating meals provided by staff members who had come to believe in her cause. During those 3 months, Eleanor learned that she was not alone. Sarah found 17 other cases with patterns similar to Eleanor's, patients committed on questionable evidence, whose families had subsequently gained control of their assets. Some of those patients had died in Whispering Pines, their deaths attributed to natural causes that no one had bothered to investigate. Others had been released years later, broken and medicated into compliance, unable to articulate what had been done to them. A few, like Eleanor, had simply been forgotten, warehoused in the system until they became invisible. Dr. Harold Brennan's signature appeared on every single one of their commitment papers. He wasn't just corrupt, Sarah told Eleanor one evening, spreading documents across the conference table at Justice Works. He was running a business. Families would approach him, or he'd approach them, with a proposal. For the right price, he'd make their inconvenient relative disappear into the psychiatric system. Legally, cleanly, with all the proper paperwork. How did no one notice? People did notice. There were complaints filed over the years, investigations that went nowhere. But Brennan had connections. Hospital administrators who looked the other way, county officials who owed him favors, and the families who used his services had every incentive to keep quiet. Sarah's expression was grim. The psychiatric system is built on the assumption that patients can't be trusted. Once you're labeled mentally ill, everything you say becomes suspect. It's the perfect crime. Eleanor thought about all the times she'd tried to tell someone the truth, all the times she'd been dismissed as delusional, all the times her protests had been noted in her chart as evidence of her continued instability. What happens now? Now, Sarah said, we go public. The story broke on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Sarah's article appeared on the front page of the Millbrook Independent, above the fold, with a headline that Eleanor read 3 times before she believed it was real: 30 years of silence. How a local doctor imprisoned innocent patients for profit. The article was comprehensive, meticulous, and devastating. It detailed Eleanor's case from beginning to end, the suspicious commitment, the bribe documented in Brennan's own handwriting, the 30 years of wrongful imprisonment. But it didn't stop there. It named other victims, other families, other lives destroyed by a system that had been corrupted from the inside. By noon, the story had been picked up by regional news outlets. By evening, it was national. Eleanor watched it unfold from the Justice Works office, surrounded by Margaret and Sarah and the small team of volunteers who had become her unlikely family over the past 3 months. The television showed reporters outside Whispering Pines, demanding statements from administrators who had suddenly become unavailable. It showed Dr. Brennan's retirement community, where he had barricaded himself inside his unit and refused to comment. It showed Patricia Vance's real estate office, its doors locked and its lights dark. And it showed 742 Maple Street, her house, her home, standing abandoned and waiting, while a reporter explained that the property remained legally in Eleanor Vance's name despite 30 years of attempted theft. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked, sitting beside her. Eleanor considered the question carefully. How did she feel? After 30 years of silence, 30 years of being told she was crazy, 30 years of having her reality denied and dismissed, how was she supposed to feel now that the world was finally listening? "I feel," she said slowly, "like I'm finally allowed to exist again." The legal consequences unfolded over the following weeks. Dr. Harold Brennan, confronted with evidence of his crimes, suffered a stroke 2 days after the article was published. He survived, but was left unable to speak clearly, a cruel irony that Eleanor noted without satisfaction. He would face no criminal charges. The statute of limitations had long since expired, but Margaret filed civil suits on behalf of Eleanor and 6 other victims, seeking damages that would likely consume whatever remained of Brennan's estate. More importantly, the state medical board launched an investigation that would ultimately result in the posthumous revocation of his license. A symbolic gesture, perhaps, but one that mattered to the families who had spent decades wondering if they were the only ones who knew the truth. Richard Vance proved harder to locate. Eleanor's son had apparently seen the news coverage and fled, leaving behind a trail of unpaid debts and angry creditors. Margaret suspected he had left the state entirely, perhaps the country. There was a warrant out for his arrest, not for Eleanor's wrongful commitment, but for the financial crimes that Sarah's investigation had uncovered along the way. Years of fraud, embezzlement, and forgery that had nothing to do with his mother, but everything to do with the character that had made him capable of betraying her in the first place. Patricia was another matter. Eleanor's daughter had not fled. She had hired lawyers, expensive lawyers, the kind that charged more per hour than most people earned in a week, and she had released a statement expressing shock and dismay at the allegations against her late colleague, Dr. Brennan. She denied any involvement in her mother's commitment, claimed that she had been misled by her brother and the doctor she trusted, and positioned herself as another victim of a terrible misunderstanding. "She's lying," Eleanor said flatly, reading the statement in Margaret's office. "She was there," she testified. "She looked me in the eyes and told that doctor I was dangerous." "I know," Margaret replied, "and we're going to prove it." The deposition took place on a Thursday afternoon in late April, in a conference room at Margaret's office that had been transformed into a makeshift courtroom. Patricia arrived with her legal team, 3 lawyers in expensive suits, carrying briefcases that probably cost more than Eleanor's monthly expenses had been for the entire 30 years of her imprisonment. She was dressed conservatively, her silver hair pulled back, her expression carefully composed into something that might have been concern or might have been contempt. She did not look at Eleanor when she entered the room. "Mrs. Patricia Vance Morrison," Margaret began, once the preliminary formalities were completed. "You were present at your mother's psychiatric evaluation on January 14th, 1994. Is that correct?" Patricia's lead lawyer objected, citing relevance. Margaret overruled him smoothly. This was a deposition, not a trial, and the rules were different. Patricia was compelled to answer. "I was present," she said carefully. "I was concerned about my mother's well-being, and during that evaluation, you provided testimony to Dr. Brennan about your mother's alleged symptoms. What did you tell him?" Patricia recited the same lies she had told 30 years ago, the paranoid episodes, the confusion, the aggressive outbursts. Her voice was steady, rehearsed, as if she had practiced this moment in front of a mirror until it became second nature. Eleanor listened without expression. She had heard these lies before. She had lived with their consequences for 3 decades. "Mrs. Vance Morrison," Margaret continued, "I'm going to show you a document. This is a letter written by Dr. Harold Brennan to your brother Richard, dated January 3rd, 1994, 11 days before your mother's evaluation. Please read the highlighted portion aloud." Patricia's composure flickered. She looked at her lawyers, who looked at each other, who looked at the document Margaret was sliding across the table. "I don't see why this is relevant. Read it, please." Patricia picked up the letter. Her hands, Eleanor noticed, were trembling slightly. "Per our agreement," Patricia read, her voice losing its rehearsed steadiness, "I've reviewed the documentation you provided regarding your mother's alleged symptoms. I want to be clear that what you're describing does not constitute grounds for involuntary commitment under standard diagnostic criteria. However, given the circumstances you've outlined and the financial consideration we discussed, I'm prepared to conduct an evaluation that will support your petition." She stopped reading. "Continue, please," Margaret said. Patricia's voice was barely above a whisper now. "Please ensure your sister is present during the evaluation to corroborate your account. Consistency in family testimony is essential for the paperwork to hold up." The room was silent. "Mrs. Vance Morrison," Margaret said quietly, "this letter indicates that you were not merely present at your mother's evaluation. You were a co-conspirator in a scheme to have her falsely committed so that you and your brother could take control of her property. Do you deny this?" Patricia looked up, not at Margaret, but at Eleanor. For the first time in 30 years, mother and daughter's eyes met. Eleanor expected to see defiance. She expected to see the cold calculation that had characterized Patricia since childhood, the ruthless ambition that had driven her to build an empire on the foundation of her mother's suffering. Instead, she saw fear, and beneath the fear, something that might have been shame. "I was 28 years old," Patricia said, her voice cracking. "Richard told me it was the only way. He said Mom was going to lose the house anyway, that Dad's medical bills had destroyed everything, that we were doing her a favor by taking control before she ended up on the street. And you believed him?" "I wanted to believe him." Patricia's composure collapsed entirely, tears streaming down her carefully made-up face. "I wanted to believe that we were helping her, that she really was confused, that Dr. Brennan knew what he was talking about. Because the alternative," she choked on the words, The alternative was that I helped destroy my own mother's life for money. You did destroy her life, Eleanor said. It was the first time she had spoken during the deposition, and her voice cut through the room like a blade. 30 years, Patricia. You took 30 years from me. You took my home, my freedom, my right to exist as a human being. And you never visited. Not once. Patricia covered her face with her hands. I couldn't face you. I thought, if I just didn't think about it, if I pretended you didn't exist, then maybe it wouldn't be real. Maybe I could be someone other than the person who did that to her own mother. And did it work? Patricia shook her head, sobbing. No, God help me, it never worked. Not for a single day. If you've been following Eleanor's story from the beginning, I want you to know something. This moment, this confrontation, isn't about revenge. It's not about making Patricia suffer the way Eleanor suffered. It's about something far more important. The truth, finally spoken aloud, because that's what Eleanor was denied for 30 years. Not just her freedom, but the simple acknowledgement that what happened to her was real. The legal proceedings that followed were complex and lengthy, but their outcome was never truly in doubt. Patricia, facing the documented evidence of her involvement and the prospect of civil liability that would destroy everything she'd built, chose to settle. She signed over the deed to 742 Maple Street, clear and unencumbered. She established a trust fund to cover Eleanor's living expenses and medical care for the remainder of her life, and she agreed to provide testimony against any other parties involved in similar schemes, testimony that would ultimately help close the loopholes that had allowed Dr. Brennan to operate for so long. What she would not do, what Eleanor did not ask her to do, was apologize. Some things can't be apologized for, Eleanor told Margaret afterward, and some wounds don't heal with words. Patricia knows what she did. She'll live with it for the rest of her life. That's not justice exactly, but it's something. What about you? Margaret asked. What do you live with? Eleanor considered the question carefully. I live with the truth, she said finally. For 30 years, they told me I was crazy. They told me my memories were delusions, my protests were symptoms, my entire reality was a fabrication of a diseased mind. And I almost believed them. There were days, dark days, when I wondered if maybe they were right. Maybe I had imagined the life I remembered. Maybe I really was the person they said I was. She paused, looking out the window at the spring sunshine that she had almost forgotten existed. But I held on to one thing, she continued. One thing they couldn't take from me, no matter how many pills they gave me or how many years they kept me locked away. I held on to the knowledge that I knew who I was, Eleanor Marie Vance, Walter's wife, a woman who deserved better than what her children did to her, and I was right. I was right all along. The house at 742 Maple Street took 8 months to restore. Eleanor oversaw every detail of the renovation, working with contractors who had heard her story and offered their services at cost. The roof was replaced, the foundation was repaired, the walls were stripped down to their bones and rebuilt with the same care that Walter had lavished on them 60 years before. She kept some things unchanged, the built-in bookshelves that Walter had made with his own hands, the tin ceiling in the kitchen that he had restored, the secret compartment where he had hidden the evidence that eventually set her free. These were her connections to him, to the life they had built together, to the love that had survived everything her children had tried to destroy. Other things she changed. The wallpaper came down, replaced by paint in colors Eleanor had never been allowed to choose before. The furniture was new, comfortable, practical, suited to a woman in her 70s who had earned the right to sit in a chair that didn't hurt her back. The garden, which had been a wilderness for 30 years, was cleared and replanted with flowers that Walter had always loved but never had time to grow. And in the living room, on the mantel above the fireplace that Walter had built, Eleanor placed 2 photographs. One was their wedding picture, restored from the water-damaged original that she had found in his secret compartment. The other was a photograph of Walter alone, taken a few months before his death, sitting on the front porch of this very house with a cup of coffee in his hand and a smile on his face. I finished it, Eleanor told him every morning when she came downstairs and saw his face. Just like you asked. The first visitor to the restored house was not expected. Eleanor was in the garden, 6 months after moving back in, when she heard footsteps on the path behind her. She turned, expecting Margaret or Sarah or one of the contractors who still stopped by occasionally to check on their work. Instead, she saw a young woman, mid-20s, perhaps, with dark hair and eyes that were somehow familiar. The woman stopped at the edge of the garden, uncertain, clutching a piece of paper in her hands. "Mrs. Vance?" she asked. "Eleanor Vance?" "Yes. My name is Jennifer Morrison. Patricia is my—" She stopped, swallowed. "Patricia is my mother." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her chest. She had not seen Patricia since the deposition, had not spoken to her since the settlement was finalized. She had assumed, hoped perhaps, that that chapter of her life was closed. "What do you want?" Eleanor asked, not unkindly, but not warmly either. Jennifer took a step closer, then stopped again, as if afraid of crossing some invisible boundary. "I want you to know that I didn't know. About any of it, I mean. Mom never talked about her family, never mentioned she had a mother still living. I thought all my grandparents were dead." She held out the piece of paper, a photograph, Eleanor realized. A picture of Eleanor holding a baby, taken sometime in the 1970 seconds. "I found this in her things last month. I confronted her about it, and she told me everything. About you, about what she and Uncle Richard did, about all of it." Jennifer's voice broke. "I'm so sorry. I know that doesn't mean anything coming from me, but I needed you to know that I'm sorry, that someone in this family is sorry for what they did to you." Eleanor looked at the photograph. The baby in her arms was Patricia, tiny, innocent, unburdened by the person she would become. Eleanor remembered that day, remembered the joy of holding her daughter, remembered believing that she would do anything to protect this child. She had done everything, and the child had grown up to betray her anyway. "You're not responsible for your mother's choices," Eleanor said finally. "You don't need to apologize for them. But I want to know you," Jennifer said, the words rushing out. "If you'll let me, I want to know who you really are. Not the story Mom told herself to justify what she did. I want to know my grandmother." Eleanor looked at this young woman, her granddaughter, she realized, flesh of her flesh, someone who had existed for 25 years without Eleanor knowing about her. Another thing her children had stolen, the chance to watch this girl grow up, to know her, to be part of her life. "I'm 74 years old," Eleanor said. "I spent 30 years in a place I should never have been, and I've spent the last year learning how to be a person again. I don't know if I'm very good at being a grandmother." "I don't need you to be good at it," Jennifer said. "I just need you to be real." Eleanor thought about Walter, about his letter, about the faith he had placed in her ability to survive and to find the truth. She thought about Margaret and Sarah and all the people who had helped her when her own children would not. She thought about the house behind her, restored and waiting, empty except for her memories and her ghosts. "Would you like to come inside?" Eleanor asked. "I could make us some tea." Jennifer's face transformed with a smile that reminded Eleanor painfully of Patricia as a child, before whatever had gone wrong had gone wrong. "I would like that very much," Jennifer said. The story of Eleanor Vance did not end with the restoration of her home or the settlement with her daughter or the exposure of Dr. Brennan's crimes. It continued in the legislation that was passed the following year, requiring independent oversight of long-term psychiatric commitments. It continued in the investigations that Margaret and Sarah launched into similar facilities across the state, uncovering patterns of abuse that had gone undetected for decades. It continued in the support group that Eleanor started meeting with monthly, other survivors, other people who had been dismissed and silenced and imprisoned, who finally had someone who understood. And it continued in the small moments that no one would ever write about. The morning cups of tea on the porch that Walter had built. The visits from Jennifer, who came every Sunday and was slowly learning her grandmother's story. The letters from strangers who had read about Eleanor's case and wanted her to know that her courage had given them hope. One afternoon, nearly 2 years after her escape from Whispering Pines, Eleanor was sitting in her garden when Margaret Chen came to visit. The lawyer looked tired but satisfied, carrying a folder that she set on the table between them. "Brennan's estate has been settled," Margaret said. "The funds have been distributed to the victims. It's not enough. It could never be enough, but it's something." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you. For everything. I should be thanking you." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying the garden that Eleanor had brought back to life. "Before your case, I was starting to lose faith in this work. Too many losses, too many systems designed to protect the powerful at the expense of everyone else. Then you walked into my office with a bag of 30-year-old documents and reminded me why I became a lawyer in the first place. Because you wanted to help people, because I wanted to believe that the truth matters. That someone who's been wronged can still find justice even when everything is stacked against them." Margaret smiled. "You proved me right." Eleanor thought about the young woman who had walked into Justice Works nearly 2 years ago, desperate, exhausted, clinging to evidence that might have been worthless in less determined hands. She thought about all the moments when she could have given up, when the obstacles seemed insurmountable, when the voice in her head whispered that maybe it would be easier to just disappear back into the system that had already taken so much from her. "I didn't prove anything," Eleanor said finally. "I just refused to forget who I was." Everything else followed from that. That evening, after Margaret had gone, Eleanor walked through her house one final time before bed. She touched the bookshelves Walter had built, ran her fingers along the windowsills he had sanded smooth, paused in the kitchen where she had cooked 10,000 meals for a family that had not deserved her love. The house was quiet now, but it was not empty. It was filled with memory, with history, with the accumulated weight of a life that had been interrupted but not destroyed. On the mantel, Walter's photograph smiled at her in the lamplight. "I found it," Eleanor told him, as she did every night. "I finished it, and now I'm going to rest." She climbed the stairs to the bedroom they had shared for 40 years, the bedroom where he had died in her arms, the bedroom she had been stolen from on a January morning 30 years ago. The bed was new. She could not have slept in the old one, even if it had survived, but the view from the window was the same. The old oak tree in the front yard, the streetlight at the corner, the quiet street where she had raised her children and buried her husband and lost everything that mattered. Eleanor Vance lay down in her own bed, in her own house, in the life that had been stolen from her and reclaimed through 30 years of patience and one moment of courage. She closed her eyes, and for the first time, in 3 decades, she slept without dreaming of escape. Thank you for staying with Eleanor through this entire journey. Her story reminds us of something important, that the people society dismisses, the crazy ones, the inconvenient ones, the ones locked away and forgotten, are often the ones who see most clearly, and that the truth, no matter how long it's been buried, has a way of coming back to light. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it, someone who's been silenced, someone who's been dismissed, someone who's been told that their reality isn't real, because Eleanor Vance is not just one woman's story. She's every person who ever held on to the truth when the world tried to take it away. Until next time, take care of each other. And remember, you know who you are. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise.